Welcome to part one of the Royal Griff's review of The Prince and the Doctor. This short TRG series is a summary breakdown and in-depth critical review of the live intimate conversation that I was a part of, participating from my one-party consent state of New York. For illustration purposes, as the participants like myself were strictly prohibited to share any of the original materials presented in this intimate conversation together, I used my superior note-taking skills and my creative mind to illustrate effectively my opinions on what was discussed by the Prince and the Doctor, to do my part in fighting against misinformation, because as you know, the Prince tells everyone it is a humanitarian crisis. Any critique that I make in this video will come from direct quotes that I wrote down during my participation in this intimate, allegedly live conversation from my one-party consent state of New York. All characters and event scenarios, even though based on real events and people, are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to persons living or dead is purely coincidental and should be viewed only for its illustrative storytelling purposes. And of course, this is all stipulated at the very beginning in my video content legal disclaimers, so feel free to rewind this video if you missed it. Okay, so let's get into ripping this apart. So the session kicks off and Dr. Mate wastes no time in explaining the two streams or two camps of responses seen when the invitations went out for this session to the public. This is what he said.
It struck me there were two divergent streams of responses to this proposed event that is now taking place. It seemed to me they were the people that hadn't read your book, and then it was those that probably did, or at least knew something about it. The first stream was hostile. It seems to have been people that have read about the book but not the book itself. They see you as just wallowing in self-pity and presenting yourself as a victim. The other stream was just so grateful that this is happening because they really are craving an honest conversation about loss and grief and trauma and woundedness and healing. Do you see yourself as a victim, or where do you see yourself between those two extremes of responses? Where do you position yourself?
So right from the start, the tone was being set to disregard that there was a third stream of people who actually read the book, like myself, and still see this man manipulating the public, his family, and exploiting vulnerable people with zero consequences. The positioning is you're either supportive and worship the prince, or you're being dismissed because you didn't read the book but relied on the evil British press and what they had to say. I think this question was so incredibly stupid because, of course, the prince was going to say no. He doesn't see himself as a victim, and he has yet to take any accountability. Even throughout this entire session, he takes no accountability. In fact, he hails himself as some type of savior, and that by him telling his story, it's helping so many people around the world. But here is the direct quote and the exact words that he said, so there's no misunderstanding or misinformation being spread.
I certainly don't see myself as a victim. I'm really grateful to be able to share my story in the hope that it will help encourage others, and hopefully let people understand that again, back to the human experience, that we are in some shape or form all connected, especially through trauma.
It's exactly this what rubs me the wrong way. In no way do I want any connection to the toxicity of this couple. Right there, he honestly feels that his story is going to help many others as it's so relatable. He's really grateful to moan and whine, thinking people really give a shit to hear how he didn't get enough hugs as a kid. We all have trauma, but in no way are we connected through that trauma because he lacks the ability to think of others. And he's not interested in their stories because he does say later on in this interview that listening to these stories can bring him down. But we'll visit his exact words later on to ensure that his true, authentic self is represented.
But no, I do not. And I have never looked for sympathy in this. For me, the experiences that I've had throughout my childhood, throughout my life, throughout my 38 years, albeit relatively short, I'm not looking forward to becoming 48, that's for sure. But through those experiences and through the work that I've done for 2 decades now around mental health and mental illness, I've always felt as though sharing whatever I can of my story will help someone or some people out there.
This man really believes that his story is so inspiring. What I got from this whole entire interview was that he really just wants people to validate him all day, telling him how great and fabulous he is. So, in this very brief and short answer, he honestly thinks that he is a qualified professional to talk about mental health because he has had all this experience with it. He completely contradicts himself later on in this interview. Right now, he's saying that he has all this experience and that for 2 decades he had been working around mental health and mental illness. And he said, whatever he shared, he felt that his story will somehow help other people out there. He's a walking contradiction because later on in this interview, he admits that he didn't take therapy so seriously until Megan came around and talked him into doing it. So, what is it? Megan came on the scene in what, 2016? That was not 2 decades worth of mental health, mental illness work for him to deem and say he's here to help so many people when he doesn't even have his affairs in order. I didn't want to waste $33.09 on this crap. However, knowing that this man is a source, actually a super spreader of misinformation, it is important that the garbage that he is spewing out of his mouth to people who are vulnerable, who they're taking advantage of because maybe they're in a place where they need help and they're looking to him because he is trying to push himself as a source for mental health and the savior for it. This was so dangerous. And the fact that the doctor later on, and you're going to hear those exact words where the doctor is telling this guy he knows more than some of the professionals that he knows. Tell me how dangerous is that? This man already thinks that he is qualified to counsel people when he has no degree, no education, and he's doing it. And what's even disgusting about all of this is that even though he wants to change the stigma around mental health, well, then why make this so private? If you're trying to spread the word about what you're trying to do, then why force people to buy your book in order to hear your words of wisdom? The people who really need to hear these encouraging words of wisdom around mental health are the people that are struggling to put food on their table, to worry about how they're going to keep a roof over their head to take care of their children. You talk about stress and how that impacts the body. Well, when you're faced in a situation where you have to survive, you don't have a choice. And the last thing you're going to do is spend $33 on a book that is completely filled with lies. One of the things that really pissed me off as this was going on was Harry's constant need to interrupt the doctor and give advice, almost as if Harry was the doctor. So here is an example of that. Try and picture, and I did the best that I could. You have the doctor speaking and telling about his experience, and then Harry chimes in to then talk about vulnerability, almost as if to teach the doctor something that he doesn't already know.
Like I talk about my own dysfunctions, problems, issues, the strains in my marriage, everything, because it is so human. It's not personally that you and I.
But that vulnerability helps so many other people. And I've shared enough over my life. There's people that have shared things of my life outside of my control, be it true or false, but to be able to share the things of my life that I think are important for other people, it feels good, but to me it feels like an act of service. And I think that's probably the same for you as well, which is that vulnerability is so important. And if we can encourage other people to be vulnerable themselves, to be able to have conversations with their own families and conversations with themselves and acknowledge what has happened to them, then I think the world would be a better place.
I'm listening to this because I'm a participant as part of this event and saying to myself, who the F does this guy think he is? He literally interrupted the doctor to then talk to him about himself. The doctor was talking about his experience and he was going into a good story. And this is exactly what he did. And it's not just one time that Harry did this. Harry did this on several other occasions. But I'm pointing this out because, as you can see, he clearly thinks that he knows more about mental health than an actual doctor. having no training, no certifications, no degrees. This would be like the equivalent of me acting like a lawyer without putting the disclaimer saying to everybody that it's not supposed to be taken for legal advice. I'm not a professional. Like, he's not doing any of that. He should be saying, I'm not a medical professional. You should be going to see somebody to confirm this. Here is a resource you can use. But no, he's not doing any of that. Harry is seriously a walking liability. And if Penguin Random House really understood that, then they wouldn't have put him on in this private, intimate session to have this therapy session in which we were all participating, because think about HIPAA law. Also, those that are watching it who are like so down and out thinking that, oh, if Harry did this, then maybe I will take these drugs. If he started using it recreational, let me try it before I go see somebody and be supervised for it. This was beyond reckless and irresponsible, in my opinion. So the doctor then proceeds to grab the conversation back and take control to then define what vulnerability is, because Harry was starting to take over as if he was the therapist.
Now, for those that are not sure what vulnerability means, it comes from the Latin word vulnerability to wound, and it's human beings. We're all profoundly vulnerable from conception to death. The only question is, do we acknowledge our vulnerability or do we deny it? And I think this culture often denies vulnerability. Now, you told me in our preliminary conversation that until you began therapy, it's like you lived in a bubble and begin therapy just burst that bubble for you. You talk about the bubble that you lived in and what you mean by that and what that bursting of the bubble meant for you.
I think I'm still to this day unclear as whether it was one bubble or whether it was multiple.
Good point.
But if you see in the film The Boy in the Bubble, it kind of felt like that to some extent, but my awareness, to my own story, my own self was distorted, perhaps because of my environment that I was confined in, but also, again, society. And I think what it does to you to be almost like box you in. And I would say first discovery, go a little bit deeper to maybe unpack some of the stuff that had happened, and that I had a bubble that burst. I didn't find a therapist that suited me, so I gave up on the search. But that was certainly the initial part where I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress.
So now, as you can see, none of that made any kind of sense. Harry was all over the place and talking about this bubble that he was in and his environment, and then started talking to the doctor as if this is what you should be doing, and then coming back to himself. It was almost like he was talking in third person, advising the doctor, but then coming back to himself. At least that's how I interpreted it. But I don't think he fully understands what vulnerability really means. And when we talk about vulnerabilities, it is about affecting your mental and physical state. So, for instance, and I'll just share an example, if you're going through something that's really traumatic, post traumatic stress, as he says, Harry, one thing that I need to note here, Harry refuses to say post traumatic stress disorder. And later on in this interview, he actually corrects the doctor because he gets annoyed that the doctor says that he was diagnosed with PTSD. And he goes, no, PTSI, illness. I don't call it a disorder, right? And we'll get into him thinking that he's not sick because he clearly is sick. To me, my impression that I got over this is that he's not putting the work in. Because clearly, if he was, he would not be stuck back in talking about this same trauma and staying in this place, especially if he's been spending 2 decades working on mental illness and mental health. So also, Harry doesn't say exactly when he saw this therapist that he didn't take to when he was diagnosed with PTS without the D. He wouldn't accept it. So in my mind, I'm thinking, well, was this when you were a little boy? I don't think so, considering he had said that he didn't have therapy until he met Megan. But then we found out that it was his brother and his sister-in-law who got him the help that he needed, or at least started him on this path. So his story conflicts and it's all over the place. This is why he should not be looked at as someone serious to be advocating and advising others on mental health when he doesn't even have his own shit together. Another thing that I noticed that Harry did throughout this entire interview was mentioned a few times now whenever like the doctor would diagnose him with something, or he's talking about being diagnosed with PTSD, and him admitting that he didn't want to accept it. And in some way, I think that he does feel deep down, even though he's preaching that it's okay to remove the stigma of mental health because we all have challenges. I think himself has issues with the fact that he has mental issues. And that's why he's so adamant to not accept that this is what he's been diagnosed with. Instead, having to change the language, the wording of it, not being able to hear the criticism, not wanting to face that he does have real problems. And I think that's very dangerous, because when you have somebody who's not even willing to admit and accept and be comfortable with that this is who you are, I think he is very much not wanting to admit that there is a part of him that is damaged. He doesn't want to be seen as having any type of disability or handicap, but he does. He has one.
And I said, well, it hurt at first, but then it made total sense because as a kid, that is exactly what happened to me. Certainly one major element that I remember. But for sure there was more before that, like most of us. And then when I found my therapist and started to really unpack 12-year-old H at the point of where my mother died, yes, that started to unravel all sorts of other moments.
So here he is right now admitting to the fact that he really didn't start digging into this work until he saw this therapist, which we all know was after he got married. So over the last couple of years, whatever or whoever that he has been working with is only recent. So he can't say that he has 2 decades worth of experience in mental health and mental illness when he didn't even understand his own mental illness until recently. And then learning these skills, actually, it's a new tool set of skills that he is relearning in order to be able to function in society. But as we can see here, he's not even willing to accept that there's work that needs to be done and he's not doing it. I don't see it. And Harry does say in this interview for a long time that he avoided this therapy because he didn't want to lose the sadness that he felt for his mother. So he had been walking around with this grief, holding on to it because he wanted to, not because he couldn't get help. It was because he wanted to, for fear that he was going to lose whatever he remembered of his mom if he went to this therapy and they unpacked everything, and then all of a sudden now he didn't feel this grief anymore. Personally, I don't believe this story. He is demonstrated to be this arrogant little prick, and I guarantee when, it was time for him to go to therapy, he refused because he was ashamed. He didn't want to go see a therapist because, again, he goes back to this removing of the stigma of mental health. Well, obviously, he recognizes that there's a stigma there. And God forbid that, back in the day when he was a teenager or even an early adult, he didn't want to be telling people that he was going to a shrink. He didn't want people to think that he was crazy. As is, we're still seeing the remnants of his pride getting in the way of saying that he has an actual problem. And to be fair, I can understand if he was ashamed of, going to somebody to talk about his problems. And I can see that the family, maybe being unemotional, he definitely felt that he couldn't really express himself and that he held it inside. Also, too, he didn't want to risk being made fun of, or at least the fear of being made fun of. And I think that feeling is absolutely normal. I'm sure many people have felt that way. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that there is not a stigma that exists around mental health, because it certainly is. I'm just saying that he might not be the best person at this moment. Not saying ever, but at this moment, he's not the right person to be advising on how to get over your mental illness and your mental health issues, because he still has to work his out. So then Harry continues to talk about his mom and how he finally realized that, she would want him to be happy and that he's finally understanding that. The doctor then goes into talking about and defining trauma. I actually really liked the way that the doctor had explained what trauma is. and the way that he explained trauma.
Let's just define trauma in a way that people can understand because they tend to have sort of on one hand, trauma is a word that's misused. It's used somewhat promiscuously. People say, I went to a picnic, and it rained and it was traumatic. No, it wasn't. It was just disappointing where I saw a movie and I was traumatized. No, you won't. You're just upset. But trauma actually means a wound. It comes from a Greek word for wound or wounding. And it's a wound that doesn't heal. So psychologically, people are wounded early in life, and until that wound heals, they're carrying the imprints of that tone. So recognizing trauma is not being victimized, it's actually allowing the possibility of healing that wound.
But then, of course, Dr. Harry has to interject with his definition of trauma and then sort of get on the same level as the doctor now in knowing or being the expert and specialist on trauma.
I've said it before, I think it was a couple of years ago in the mental health documentary that I did with Oprah. And it was something that I really believe in. I believe that 99.9% of us all on planet Earth right now are carrying around some form of unresolved grief, trauma, and all loss. Yeah, and the sooner that we all accept that we are all carrying that, then the sooner we can all get along.
As you can see, in my opinion, he thinks he is the expert. And this is verbatim. So I'm not misquoting anything that Harry has said, and I'm not twisting any narrative. As you can see in this small little snapshot of what was discussed, Harry really does feel like he is some advisor, and perhaps this is what he's going to be focusing on as his life purpose. That's fine and all, but I think he should really focus on himself first and work on himself until he can show that he can be compassionate towards others instead of continuing to keep talking about himself. So we're going to pause right here. In part 2, we're going to be talking about Harry's discussion around being a father and how he was not hugged as a child and the experience that he had versus the experience that he's giving to his invisible kids now, which there's a lot of holes in that we're going to be poking at. So it'd be a good place to stop. But please let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section. But as always, I will be back soon with more content. But until then, please be safe, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.
I was such a fraud.